Guys, how's it going? TJ here with Dead History, and welcome to our next Vice Presidential Series installment as we're taking a look at the 32nd Vice President of the United States, John Nance Garner, the man behind me. Some cool things to tell you about Garner, but first, before we get into our 32nd Vice President, what I need you to do is hit subscribe down below. Give us a like and a thumbs up. Leave all those comments and questions. We love those. And of course, hit the little notification bell so you can be notified when we do release a new video. And of course, if Henry was here, he'd be on cue. That is every single week. So here we go. Next Vice Presidential Series installment, John Nance Garner. Very excited. Let's get to it. And this is Dead History. Hey guys, TJ back with you. Yeah, and the older guy behind me, that's John Nance Garner, the 32nd Vice President of the United States. Some really cool things to tell you about Garner as I wear my Plodding Through the President's t-shirt. Yeah, my Gouverneur Morris t-shirt, which is very, very cool. So check that out. Plodding Through the President's awesome podcast. And of course, check out their store. They got some really fun, great t-shirts. So here we go. John Nance Garner, 32nd Vice President. He was actually the oldest living Vice President ever. He lived to be 98 years old. Yeah, long time. He was actually Speaker of the House before he became Vice President. He was a Speaker of both houses. As in a matter of fact, him and Schuyler Colfax are the only two people to be Speaker of the House and then become Vice President of the United States. So some very cool things from a very, very small little town in South Central Texas. Yeah, I went all the way down there. Not very far, maybe like 90 to 100 miles from the Mexican border. Yeah, way down there. Gonna show you all that, of course. So here we go. You did the likes, you did the subscribes, you did the comments and questions, you did all that good stuff. If Henry was here, he'd let you know that now you gotta go get the popcorn, the potato chips, the pretzels, the soda, whatever it is you like to snack on, and for a refreshment, go grab it. Because here we go. Next Vice Presidential Series installment, 32nd Vice President, John Nance Garner. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Hey guys, how's it going? TJ here with Dead History, and welcome to our next Vice Presidential Series installment as we're taking a look at the 32nd Vice President of the United States, John Nance Garner. Hope you enjoyed our little intro, as always. I am flying solo this week, as you can tell. So it's just me, and it's also just me solo for this audio. Some cool things to tell you about Garner. It's going to be interesting. Not sure how long each of these videos will be, but it seems like recently anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour for each video. It seems to be the MO lately. So we're going to take a look here in this part one at his early life, childhood, his youth, and then his rise in politics and leading all the way up to his vice presidency. And then tomorrow we'll get into part two with his vice presidency, legacy, death at the ripe old age of 98 years old. Yeah, so pretty crazy stuff. So let's just jump right in. We have some announcements coming up, but we'll leave those for another week. Some very fun, exciting stuff on the horizon for Dead History, so we definitely will be announcing those soon. So let's just jump right in here. Our next Vice Presidential Series installment, the 32nd Vice President of the United States, John Nance Garner. Here we go. My belief has always been in executive leadership, not executive rulership. John Nance Garner. There is hardly any limitation upon the ways in which the Vice President might be of service to the President, wrote Franklin Delano Roosevelt in a 1920 issue of the Saturday Evening Post when he was the Democratic vice presidential candidate. The Vice President, Roosevelt, suggested should be entrusted with carrying the large burden of interpreting administrative policies to Congress and to the public. Like the Vice President in a modern corporation, he should be a super handyman, handling various matters of detail, and leaving the President free to deal mainly with matters of policy. Upon becoming president a dozen years later, however, Roosevelt had adjusted his image of the vice presidency to more closely match the predispositions of the man that the Democratic National Convention nominated to be his running mate, John Nance Garner. As vice president, Garner would indeed work extensively at interpreting administration policies to Congress as the White House's chief liaison to Capitol Hill. But he did little to communicate these policies to the public because he refused to be a spokesman or campaigner. He did provide the administration with expertise on matters of detail, but limited this advice mostly to the intricacies of maneuvering legislation through Congress. Garner's long career in the House of Representatives had prepared him for the vice presidency. He had rarely originated innovative ideas to answer the problems of the country, yet once someone else conceived an idea for legislation, Garner was often called upon to serve as a parliamentary midwife. He would expertly guide the plan through the House, from negotiations in smoky back rooms to a debate and vote on the floor. On the surface, there appears to be little mystery about John Nance Garner. Plain-spoken and refreshingly unpretentious, Cactus Jack from the tiny backcountry town of Uvalde, Texas, was by all accounts a man of common words, simple tastes, a frugal lifestyle, and an unswerving pragmatism that prompted Roosevelt to dub him Mr. Common Sense. Yet for all his uncomplicated personality, Garner remains an enigmatic presence in history. For 38 years in Washington, from 1903 to 1941, Garner continued to be a secretive backroom operator. Because nearly all of his most important political activities took place out of the public eye and off the record, his personal motivations or convictions remain unclear. It is particularly difficult to gauge the degree to which, in his role as vice president, Garner should be credited for the legislative successes of the first Roosevelt administration or be blamed for the failures of the second. Very interesting guy. Moving on to the obscure and still basically very lesser known John Nance Garner. Here we go. Youth. Garner was born on November 22nd of 1868 in Red River County, Texas. Although political promoters later romanticized his modest upbringing in a mud-chinked log cabin, his mother, Rebecca Walpole Garner was the daughter of the town banker and a descendant of English aristocracy. At age 18, young Garner set off to enroll at the University of Tennessee, the state in which both sides of his family had roots. Finding himself handicapped by an insufficient preparatory education and various respiratory problems, however, the young man soon returned home and found work in a law office. By studying in his spare time, Garner gained entrance to the bar in 1890. He then failed in his first bid for political office as a 21-year-old candidate for city attorney. Best remembered for his acerbic quips about the worthlessness of the office, John Nance Garner of Texas was one of this country's most powerful vice presidents. He served 15 terms in the House of Representatives before his inauguration on March 4th of 1933, and during his last term in the House, he was elected Speaker. No vice president has ever brought to the office as much legislative experience and influence, and only one other man, Schuyler Colfax, has ever served as both vice president and Speaker of the House of Representatives. As President Franklin D. Roosevelt's liaison with Congress, Garner played a major role in pushing through legislation that initiated the New Deal. Early in his second term, however, Garner split with the president, and their resulting feud led to Garner's unprecedented presidential challenge in 1940 and one of the great stories of American political history. Born in a log cabin in Red River County in East Texas on November 22nd of 1868, 2 weeks after the election of President Ulysses S. Grant and Vice President Colfax, Garner was the fourth in line with his name. His father, John Nance Garner III, had come to Texas from Tennessee at the age of 6 with his widowed mother, Rebecca Walpole Garner, a descendant of Sir Robert Walpole of England. The Walpoles of Tennessee were affluent and cultured, as were the Garner and Nance families into which Rebecca married. After the Walpoles lost their fortune in the Panic of 1837, they followed the trail to Texas that fellow Tennesseans such as Sam Houston and Davy Crockett had blazed. Rebecca's good management and hard work, along with that of her 2 sons and 3 daughters, enabled the family to survive, but the children did not receive the education that had been customary for their ancestors. Nevertheless, John Nance Garner III inherited qualities that helped to make him a successful cotton grower, even in Reconstruction Texas. He was honest, companionable, thrifty, and determined to succeed. By the time Texas came back into the Union in 1870, he had begun to build the impressive and comfortable colonial home that his son, the future vice president, grew up in. It was the place where neighbors gathered to discuss politics and agriculture, share a drink from the ever-present whiskey barrel, and play poker. These occasions shaped the attitudes and interests of the future politician. Garner long remembered the resentment in Texas, and especially in his own house, that surrounded the prospect of Grant seeking a 3rd term in 1876. Texas Democrats who hailed from Tennessee were well aware of the efforts of their revered Andrew Jackson to push a constitutional amendment through Congress that would have limited a president to 1 term of 4 or 6 years. Garner also retained vivid memories of the premature celebration of Samuel J. Tilden's election to the presidency, as well as the disappointment with which those around him greeted the Electoral Commission's designation of Rutherford B. Hayes as president. The most significant event of the campaign year for Garner, however, occurred when he attended with his father a political rally at Coon Soup Hollow and heard the declamations of two candidates for constable. The youngster came away from this event with a desire to become an orator. Garner attended local schools and did well as a student, though one teacher described him as not physically capable of prolonged application. At a boarding school in nearby Bogota, he acquired a love of literature from a stern teacher with an excellent library. When he was 15, he decided to further his education by going to school in adjoining Lamar County, where a relative, J.R. Walpole, was a teacher. According to biographer Bascom N. Timmons, Garner told his mother, "I don't wish to ask Father for assistance. I don't believe I will have to." He supported himself by playing shortstop on semi-professional baseball teams and by working at odd jobs. His ideas on fiscal responsibility were fully formed at an early age. Even as a student, he continually added to his bank account. "My father told me that if I had a dime and owed no one, I was solvent," he later recounted. At the age of 18, Garner enrolled at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. Although he considered attending the newly established University of Texas, he succumbed to the ancestral pull of Tennessee. He stayed only one semester. While he might have overcome his educational inadequacies with hard work, physical ailments brought his college career to an abrupt halt. Developing problems with his eyes and lungs, Garner consulted a doctor. "He told me I wouldn't live many years," the vice president remembered. "I decided under these circumstances, the money I'd saved was worth more than an education, so I took it and went home." Returning to Texas, Garner studied law in Clarksville and continued to supplement his income by playing baseball. He was admitted to the bar in 1890 at the age of 21 and set up his own practice, which did not prosper. In 1892, he ran unsuccessfully for city attorney and soon afterward was diagnosed with tuberculosis. Seeking a drier climate, he found an opening with the law firm of Clark and Fuller in the south central Texas town of Uvalde. Years later, Garner recalled that his father advised him upon leaving to tell the truth and be a gentleman. A backroom politician. Garner moved to Uvalde, Texas for the health benefits of its dry climate. During his successful campaign for judge of Uvalde County, he met Ida Reiner, who soon became his cherished partner as both beloved wife and career-long personal secretary. I don't know if it's Eddie Reiner or Edie. It's Ettie. I believe it's Edie Reiner, but might be Eddie. Garner served as county judge from 1893 to 1896, followed by a tenure in the Texas state legislature from 1898 to 1902. When Texas gained an additional congressional seat after the 1900 census, Garner managed to secure the chairmanship of a special redistricting committee. He used this position to carve out an advantageous congressional district, from which he ran successfully in 1902 for the U.S. House of Representatives. During his first several years in the House, Garner was a silent backbencher who ingratiated himself with his colleagues by cultivating friendships and by his record of party loyalty. He was eventually rewarded with coveted committee appointments, and by the 1920s, his seniority had made him the ranking Democrat on the Ways and Means Committee and chairman of the Democrats' Committee on Committees, which chose that party's members for all House committees. His vociferous attacks on Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon's economic programs earned him a national reputation as a Jefferson-Jackson Democrat, egalitarian, rural, states' rights-oriented, and populist. In 1929, Garner was elected the floor leader of a House Democratic Party whose morale and representation had suffered a crushing blow in the 1928 elections. As minority leader, Garner relied upon informal methods to strengthen the party's influence. He enjoyed a close rapport with Republican Speaker Nicholas Longworth, his debonair alter ego. Said Garner, "I was the heathen and Nick was the aristocrat." This congressional odd couple co-hosted a daily bipartisan gathering of lawmakers in a small room deep in the bowels of the Capitol, which became known as the Bureau of Education. Like the Boar's Head Club, the site of Speaker Joe Cannon's drinking and gambling congregations that Garner had attended decades earlier, the Bureau provided a place for politicians to relax and get to know one another over a cordial drink, ignoring the 18th Amendment's ban on alcoholic beverages. The Bureau also served as an informal forum for constructive, off-the-record communications and negotiations between the two parties. In this setting, Longworth said that Garner operated as a one-man cabal. Garner presented only 4 major bills to Congress under his own name in his entire 3 decades in the House. A fact a longtime House colleague, James F. Burns of South Carolina, attributed to Garner's collaborative parliamentary style. It was his policy, whenever he had an idea, to induce a prospective opponent or a doubtful supporter to sponsor the legislation. When he achieved that, he knew his purpose was accomplished. As a result, Burns noted, the congressional record will not show the remarkable influence he exercised upon the members of the House and Senate during his long service. Garner himself later asserted that he had no more useful years than those in the ranks of or as the leader of the opposition to the majority. Between the 1930 congressional elections and the opening of the 72nd Congress on December 7th of 1931, 14 members-elect, including Longworth, died. After special elections were held to replace the deceased, the Democrats emerged with a 219 to 214 advantage, enabling Garner to become Speaker and the titular head of his party as its highest national office holder. Titular. I said titular, so it's titular. I apologize. Titular head of his party. Garner did not share the same close personal friendship with the new Republican minority leader, New York's Bertrand Small, that he had enjoyed with Longworth. The two parties were becoming increasingly polarized in their approaches in solving the crisis that gripped the national economy. In addition, a decade in the minority had permitted many House Democrats to lapse into habits of frequent absenteeism and maverick voting patterns, which the party, with its slim majority, could now ill afford. The new speaker enforced party discipline with a severity that inspired Sam Rayburn to call him a terrible, table-thumping Democrat, under the slogan, "You've got to bloody your knuckles." Garner regularly summoned House Democrats to caucus or bureau meetings where they wrangled out consensus policies to which he would then bind all of their votes. And if they didn't stay bound, he recalled, I'd put them down in my book and they'd never get through paying for it. Of his overriding concern for party solidarity, Garner once declared, I have always done what I thought was best for my country, never varying unless I was advised that 2/3 of the Democrats were for a bill and then I voted for it. In his response to the Great Depression, this dedication to maintaining a governing consensus eventually outweighed Garner's normally conservative principles, and he grew increasingly supportive of federal intervention in economic affairs. At first, the Speaker attempted to forge bipartisan cooperation in support of Herbert Hoover's economic programs such as the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and the Glass-Steagall banking bills. This conciliatory approach meant reversing his previous opposition to such measures as a manufacturer's sales tax designed to increase government revenue in the face of mounting deficits. Favored by business groups for more than a decade, an establishment of a moratorium on foreign debts in order to relieve some of the financial burden on the nation's European trading partners. By 1932, however, the overwhelming consensus among congressional Democrats and the public against the sales tax and in favor of additional relief measures convinced Garner to repudiate Hoover's program. He proposed his own federal relief spending bill through a massive public works program. This action was highly uncharacteristic, given his reluctance to offer his own proposals and his long record of opposition to increased government spending. Hoover vetoed the bill, condemning it as the most gigantic pork barrel raid ever proposed to an American Congress. Relations between the two men never recovered. The young lawyer's first impressions of Uvalde were not positive. Hell's bells, Timmons records Garner as saying to himself when he arrived, I'd rather be dead in Clarksville than alive here. Nevertheless, he immediately opened a bank account with the $150 he had brought with him and finalized arrangements to join the law firm henceforth known as Clark, Fuller, and Garner. Appointed to fill a vacancy as county judge, the junior partner rode the circuit in the 9 surrounding counties, bringing in substantial revenue for the firm, regaining his health, and developing useful contacts that would later serve his political ambitions. When Garner ran for the regular term, the opponent he defeated was Mariette Eddie Reiner, whom he married on November 25th of 1895. The couple's only child, Tully, named after Garner's law partner, was born on September 26th of 1896, breaking the line of John Nance Garner's. Defeated for re-election in 1896, the aspiring politician set his sights on a seat in the Texas House of Representatives, which he acquired in 1898. He served on the Appropriations Committee, where he opposed pork barrel legislation and established a reputation for championing economy and government and mediating disputes. Although he sought regulation of large corporations, including insurance companies and railroads, he also understood the need for economic development. Re-elected in 1900, Garner chaired the redistricting committee that created a new federal congressional district, the 15th, which contained 22 counties, including his own. He had been frank with his colleagues about his intentions to be elected to the new seat, and in 1903, his straightforwardness paid off when he became the 15th Democratic representative in the 58th Congress. 34 years old at the time of his election, Garner entered the House on a sound financial footing and with well-developed political ideas. His law practice, ranch, and bank holdings provided assets of nearly $50,000, and his political focus from the beginning was on fiscal issues. He considered an income tax the most equitable means of raising revenue, and he was a strong supporter of good economic management in government. It is just as necessary to watch the expenditure of the people's money after it is collected as it is to devise means for taxing people to produce revenue, he proclaimed during his first campaign. I, therefore, oppose centralization of government at Washington. As a Southerner, a Westerner, and a Democrat, Garner also strongly opposed a protective tariff. We must buy from other countries if we are to sell to them. Therefore, the tariff should be competitive. Though he was a talented debater, the young legislator maintained a low profile in the Republican House, which Speaker Joseph Cannon had just begun to dominate. Instead of making speeches, Garner became an ardent student of legislation and people. For the first few years, he said, I just answered roll calls, looked after chores from my constituents, studied, played poker, and got acquainted. When Cannon assigned the freshman congressman to the Committee on Railways and Canals, however, Garner immediately introduced legislation calling for a survey for a coastal canal to connect his district along the Gulf of Mexico to the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, much to the astonishment of the committee's chairman. According to the Galveston News, one purpose of Garner's bill was just to find out if such a committee really existed. Mr. Garner is always admirable in the beginning of a game to find out exactly how it is played. The Garner bill eventually became a law, and many years later, the 1,100-mile Gulf Intracoastal Waterway became a reality. Just as honesty, industry, and amiability enabled his father to prosper under the trying conditions of post-Civil War Texas, Congressman Garner became extremely popular as a minority member of the House of Representatives by exercising similar traits. Known as Cactus Jack to constituents and colleagues, he made friends with both Democrats and Republicans. Shortly after Garner entered the House, the Houston Post reported that he had not been in the Capitol 2 weeks before he was acquainted with more members of the House and the Senate and with public men generally than many members who have been here for years. He met Joe Cannon during a poker game at the exclusive Boar's Head Poker Club. Biographer Timmons' account of the meeting has Garner ending the contest and winning a large pot by beating the speaker's 3 aces with 4 fours. "Will that be enough, Mr. Speaker?" queried the freshman. "Sir," Cannon answered, "any man who can do that honestly, mind you, has my profound admiration." By all accounts, the meeting was expensive for Cannon, but the two were thereafter fast friends. Garner, nevertheless, remained a committed Democrat and in 1910 played a leading role in the successful revolt against the speaker's authoritarian leadership. As a result, the Texan established himself as an expert in parliamentary maneuvering and one of the party's most promising leaders. In 1905, Cannon moved Garner to the Foreign Affairs Committee, where he served for the next 8 years. After his first state dinner, the second-term congressman pulled no punches in providing his impressions. "As near as I have been able to figure out, the chief functions of the Committee on Foreign Affairs is to attend as many dinners and banquets and do as little work as possible." Despite such opinions, or perhaps because of them, Garner eventually became the committee's ranking Democrat. While on the committee, he met junior Republican member Nicholas Longworth of Cincinnati, Ohio, establishing the foundation for what would become an extraordinary friendship. Talented and ambitious, Garner advanced steadily in the House. He became party whip in 1909, and after Woodrow Wilson's election to the presidency and the brief return of Democratic dominance to the legislature, a member of the Ways and Means Committee in 1913. Although Garner was not as influential in the new administration's first term as he had been with the 2 previous Republican presidents, he played an important role in financial legislation. He also made it clear that he would continue to advocate economy for Democrats just as he had for Republicans. He fought for a graduated income tax against those who favored a flat rate tax, and succeeded when his plan was enacted as a part of the Underwood Tariff Act of 1913. He supported, as well as currency and banking reform efforts that led to the institution of the Federal Reserve System. Cactus Jack's status within the Wilson administration rose during World War I, however, as the president's relations with Speaker Champ Clark and Ways and Means Chairman Claude Kitchen soured. Having lost the Democratic majority in the House in the 1916 election, Wilson made Garner his liaison in that body. If the country was going to war, it would have to raise revenue, and Garner became the president's point man and the acknowledged expert on tax and tariff issues. Yet, even as he endeavored to raise the necessary sums to support the war, he never lost sight of his fundamental belief in fiscal responsibility. Garner told Wilson, "This war is going to cost us from $10 billion to $20 billion a year. Congress has never had any experience in raising such sums. The problem now is to get it to thinking in such astronomical terms. After the war, the problem will be to get it out of the habit of thinking in such terms." The Republican landslide of 1920 left only 132 Democrats in the House. Having no relish to serve again in the minority, Garner made retirement plans. The Ku Klux Klan, however, changed his mind. When Garner discovered that Texas congressmen had joined the organization, he publicly condemned it. The Klan then burned a cross near Garner's home and announced plans to facilitate his retirement. As usual, Garner did not campaign, but he did win the election. During the ensuing years of Republican ascendancy, Garner pursued his established policy of making friends rather than speeches. Only a handful of Democrats with more seniority had survived the 1920 election in the House, clearing the Texans' way for accelerated advancement within the party. In 1923, he became the ranking minority member of the Ways and Means Committee and chairman of the House Democratic Committee on Committees. 6 years later, he attained the post of minority leader, and at the same time, his friend and political adversary, Nicholas Longworth, became Speaker. These years marked the beginning of a Washington institution presided over by Garner and Longworth, in which the two-party leaders dispensed political wisdom and influenced legislation in a nonpartisan atmosphere made cordial by whiskey. Not yet liberated from prohibition by the 21st Amendment, the two legislators resorted to euphemism when describing the practice of sharing a drink with colleagues. They were striking a blow for liberty, and meetings became known as the Board of Education. During one of the first meetings of the board, Garner informed his counterpart that passage of the Smoot-Hawley tariff bill, then being considered, would allow the Democrats to regain a majority in the House and lead to Longworth's defeat as Speaker. Put a ring around that date, December 7th, 1931, he warned, if you have a calendar that far ahead. Smoot-Hawley was enacted on June 17th of 1930, and Garner's prophecy was fulfilled. He became the 39th Speaker of the House of Representatives on the very date he had foretold. He did not succeed Longworth, though, for his friend and rival had died the previous April. As Speaker, Garner presided over a slim Democratic majority of 3. Keeping that majority intact and available for votes on a daily basis was a task that demanded the full measure of the new Speaker's legislative experience and skill. In the midst of a deteriorating economic crisis, Garner decided that he could best serve the country by supporting the relief program of President Herbert Hoover's Republican administration rather than by thwarting it. I'll be criticized for following Hoover and not offering a program of our own, and I'll be accused of sabotaging Hoover, he told Tibbins. I'm not going to let it bother me. I've got skin as thick as cowhide. The speed with which proposed legislation, such as the creation of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, a moratorium on European debts, and strengthening of the Federal Reserve System, passed through the House of Representatives in the early part of the session, astonished the White House. By February of 1932, however, when the president praised Democrats for their nonpartisanship, a number of prominent party members had begun to revolt. Representative Fiorello H. LaGuardia of New York, who controlled as many as 15 votes and generally supported the Speaker, was quoted as saying, "This isn't a session of Congress. This is a kissing bee." When Garner pushed for a federal sales tax in order to counter the rapidly growing budget deficit, he was defeated. In one of his rare speeches before the House on March 29th, a few days before the vote, he outlined his fundamental beliefs regarding the importance of maintaining the financial integrity of the country. The paramount duty of the House of Representatives, he stated, is to levy sufficient taxes of some kind, of some nature, that will sustain the credit of this country in the eyes of the world, as well as our own people. Although the speaker regained lost political ground with this camp meeting speech, his mishandling of sales tax legislation, according to some commentators, weakened his candidacy as his party's presidential nominee and boosted that of Franklin D. Roosevelt. So just a couple other notes from his early life. Garner, as we said, born November 22nd of 1868 in a log cabin in Red River County, Texas, to John Nance Garner II and his wife Sarah Guest Garner. That mud chink log cabin no longer exists, but the large white 2-story house where he was raised survives and is located at 260 South Main Street in Detroit, Texas. Garner attended Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee for only one semester, as we know. 1893, Garner entered politics, running for county judge of Uvalde County. We know that. Mariette Eddy Reiner. She was a rancher's daughter. She's the one that he married, of course. They began dating after they were opponents in a primary, and they married in Sabinal, Texas on November 25th, 1895. Their son, Tully Charles Garner, he became a banker and a businessman. Mariette Garner served as her husband's secretary throughout his congressional career and as Second Lady of the United States during her husband's tenure as vice president. And to be honest, guys, that kind of leads us right up to his vice presidency and legacy and other things that we're going to cover tomorrow in part 2. So, as far as bonus footage goes, the only bonus footage I have to show you guys is tomorrow at the end of part 2, my visit to Garner's gravesite there in Uvalde, Texas. And I have a great story, some fun storytelling about my visit to his gravesite in Uvalde tomorrow for part 2. So no bonus footage here for part 1, but stay tuned. Tomorrow we will do part 2, and we will touch on the vice presidency, the legacy, his death, his gravesite, all that stuff of our 32nd Vice President of the United States, John Nance Garner III. I hope you enjoyed this part 1. Thank you so very much for everything. Thank you for the support, the subscribes, the likes, the comments, the questions, all of it. Thank you so very much. Cannot thank you guys enough. You guys truly are the best. And I'm excited for tomorrow, part 2. So stay tuned for that as we conclude this next Vice Presidential Series installment. See you tomorrow, guys. Bye-bye.